Night, a deserted street, and a huge dog howling at the hospital doors as if begging for help. The doctor follows him and finds the body of a little girl. But the scariest part? The dog knew her. And when the investigator says, "This is her family's dog, and her father was the last one to see her alive," everything gets even worse. But what the dog did next was absolutely shocking. Let's start from the very beginning. The wind slithered through the narrow streets, creeping into every dark corner, rustling fallen leaves and swaying crooked signs. Autumn in this city was always raw and relentless. A gray sky, the acrid scent of damp earth and rain-soaked concrete walls. A thick, sticky fog clung to the asphalt, swallowing the rare glimmers of streetlights as if pulling the city into an endless sleep. St. Edward's Hospital, an old stone building, loomed over the empty streets like a silent witness to someone's suffering. By day, its corridors bustled with doctors' hurried footsteps and the anxious murmurs of patients. But by night, it became a lifeless shell, ominous and cold. Its windows glowed yellow, but even that light couldn't pierce through the dense shroud of fog, as if the city itself refused to acknowledge that life still stirred within its walls. Dr. Thomas King, weighed down by exhaustion, trudged toward the reception desk. Another night shift was coming to an end, and flashes of the past hours flickered in his mind. A highway accident, a mother's hysteria after losing her child, an elderly man whose heart had stopped right in his hospital bed. It all clung to him like a dark residue. Right now, he wanted only one thing: a hot cup of coffee and the cool embrace of his sheets, pulling him into long-awaited rest. But then the silence was torn apart. A howl, low, drawn out, bone-chilling. There was no ordinary canine whimper in that sound, no irritation, only pain and desperation. Thomas shuddered. This couldn't be a coincidence. He hadn't heard the howl from some distant alley, but right at the hospital entrance. He held his breath, listening. The sound came again, long, mournful, like a funeral bell. A surge of adrenaline burned away his drowsiness. Thomas strode toward the exit, pushed open the heavy glass door, and froze on the steps. Right there, at the entrance, sat a massive dog. Dirty, emaciated, ribs jutting beneath matted fur. Dried grime streaked its face, along with something darker. Thomas squinted. Blood? The animal didn't behave like a stray. It wasn't scavenging for food, nor did it shy away from him. It just stared, with a look that was impossible to misinterpret. A silent scream. The dog whined again, pawed at the glass door, then took a few steps back, as if begging the doctor to follow. Thomas swallowed hard. "Hey, buddy, what's wrong?" he asked cautiously, eyes straining to pierce the shadow cast by the street lamp. But the dog didn't wait. It howled once more, turned, and dashed into the darkness. Without thinking, Thomas took a step forward. A chill shot down his spine. Something about this was terribly wrong. The cold crept under his clothes, clinging to his skin with a sticky, unpleasant touch. Thomas hastily pulled his jacket tighter around him and stepped into the night, following the dog, which now moved faster, its paws gliding almost silently over the wet asphalt. The animal, like a ghostly guide, weaved between parked cars, crossed the road, and confidently made its way along the dark facade of the hospital. Thomas didn't know what exactly he was expecting to find, but something inside him whispered, this was no coincidence. The dog led him to a narrow, dimly lit passage between two buildings, where medical supplies were usually unloaded. Surrounded by towering concrete walls, the alley felt more like a trap. Cargo containers, the sharp scent of medical waste, a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant wail of the wind. Then, the dog stopped. It sniffed the air nervously, then turned to Thomas and let out a low, whining sound. A warning. Thomas stepped forward, raising his flashlight. The beam caught something in the distance. At first, he only saw the shape. A small dark bundle on the ground, like discarded clothing. But as he moved closer, the light revealed something that made his chest tighten. A girl. She lay on the cold concrete, like a doll heartlessly tossed aside. Her curly blonde hair was matted with dirt and blood. Her lips, pale, almost white, seemed frozen in an unfinished whisper. Her tiny hands were unnaturally spread apart, as if, in her final moments, she had tried to defend herself. On her neck, dark, bruised marks, deep impressions pressed into her skin, the horrific evidence of her last moments. Dried blood on her lips. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't breathing. She was dead. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He exhaled sharply, dropped to his knees and shook his head, as if refusing to accept what was in front of him. The dog sat beside her. Slowly, with almost reverent care, it pressed its nose against her shoulder and let out a thin, heart-wrenching whimper. The sound cut through the stillness of the night, echoing through the empty alleyways. There was nothing ordinary about this whimper, only grief and pain. Thomas ran a trembling hand over his face. She hadn't been dead for long. This was no accident. This was murder. The police arrived within 10 minutes. Sirens sliced through the night, their echoes bouncing off the concrete walls of the narrow alley. Red and blue lights flickered across the wet asphalt, casting ghostly flames over the lifeless body of the girl. Officers moved in silent coordination, securing the crime scene with yellow tape. Detective Carol White stepped out of her car, instinctively unfastening the strap of her holster, an old habit from years on the job. Her cold brown eyes swept across the alley, lingering on the still body before shifting to Thomas. "Who found her?" Her voice was dry, steady, but with a barely perceptible tension. Thomas, still feeling the weight of what he had witnessed, gestured toward the dog. "Him. He led me here," he murmured. Carol frowned slightly and turned her attention to the animal. The dog sat motionless beside the girl, like a stone sentinel guarding someone else's tragedy. But in its eyes, there was more than just an instinctive attachment to the place. Pain, unease, and silent anticipation. Kneeling cautiously, Carol studied the dog before shifting her gaze to the girl. For a moment she froze. Something inside her cracked, like thin ice beneath her feet. Slowly, she stood up, her face darkening. "Wait." Her voice wavered. "I know her." Thomas tensed. "What?" Carol averted her gaze, as if battling some internal resistance, before finally speaking the words that now seemed inevitable. "This is Lisa Brown. Her mother reported her missing a week ago." A heavy, suffocating silence followed. "But there's something else." Carol took a deep breath. "Her father claimed she ran away." Thomas frowned. "But this dog..." He turned to look at the animal, which had not once taken its eyes off the girl's body. "He clearly knew her, and he brought us here." Carol's head snapped toward him, a flash of realization in her eyes. "You don't understand." Her voice was firm, almost cold. "This isn't just any dog. This is her family's dog." Thomas froze. Carol straightened up, running a hand over her face as if trying to process the grim picture forming in her mind. Then she turned back to the girl's body. "And her father?" She hesitated, unwilling to say it out loud, but then spoke quietly, her voice clear and deliberate. "Was the last person to see her alive." A chill spread through Thomas's chest. The air thickened, turning dense and suffocating, as if pulling him into a consuming darkness. If the dog was here, That meant it had witnessed the murder. The rain intensified, streaming down the car windows in thin rivulets. Droplets struck the windshield, smearing the glow of streetlights into long, distorted streaks. The police convoy cut through the night, piercing the city's empty streets, heading toward the outskirts, toward Henry Brown's house. Thomas sat in one of the vehicles, his fingers unconsciously clenching and unclenching the fabric of his jacket. There was a gnawing tension in his stomach, not from exhaustion, but from anticipation. Every instinct told him this man hadn't even tried to cover his tracks. He had simply hoped his lie would work. Beside him, the dog sat motionless, like a statue. But the moment the convoy pulled up in front of the house, the animal sprang to life. Its paws scrambled against the leather seat, claws tapping against the door. Thomas barely had time to open it before the dog shot out, bolting straight for the house. It didn't hesitate. It knew exactly where it was going. "Stop that dog!" someone shouted, but it was too late. The animal crashed against the door, growling viciously. Its body tensed as if ready to tear apart whoever was inside. The door burst open with a crack. Officers stormed in. The house was dark, the air thick with stale tobacco smoke and the sour stench of alcohol. The staircase groaned under the officers' heavy boots as they rushed to the second floor. In the dim light of a bedside lamp, Henry Brown was hurriedly stuffing clothes into a bag. His face was frozen in a mix of rage and panic. "Freeze!" An officer barked, gun trained on him. Henry whirled around, his breathing ragged. Dark stains of dried blood marred his shirt. "It's over, Henry," Carol said calmly, stepping forward, her voice cold. And then, a growl. The dog, breaking through the officers, lunged with such fury that even the police hesitated for a split second. Its teeth snapped inches from Henry's hand, its eyes burning with primal vengeance. Henry stumbled back, shielding himself with his arms. "Get it away from me!" he shrieked, no longer trying to act composed. The officers managed to restrain the dog, holding it back as it thrashed, snarling, its teeth bared in pure, unfiltered rage. "On your feet!" an officer commanded, yanking Henry from the room. This time, he didn't resist. Later, the pieces of the story fell into place. Henry Brown had killed his daughter in a fit of rage. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe a breakdown, maybe something else, but he had squeezed her neck too hard, for too long. And when he realized what he had done, he had panicked, rushing to dispose of the body. The dog had seen it all. It had chased after him as he dragged the girl into the alley. It had tried to stop him, but was driven away. And then, when it was all over, it hadn't left. It hadn't run. It hadn't hidden. It had stayed by her side, guarding her, until it found someone who could help. Now, it was finally over. Henry Brown was led out of the house in handcuffs. He remained silent, his head bowed, his face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. In that moment, he no longer looked like a monster, just a broken man. The dog didn't move. It simply stood on the porch, watching him go. Its eyes no longer burned with fury, only exhaustion. As the police shoved Brown into the car, the animal slowly approached Thomas and sank to the ground beside him. It let out a heavy sigh. Thomas crouched down, reaching out to run his fingers through its fur. "You did good, buddy. You're free now." The dog lifted its head, and for the first time its eyes weren't filled with pain, only relief.